In 2016, a micronation known as the Republic of Sawdustistan was founded. Although having a population that barely exceeded 50 people and being nearly microscopic on the map, Sawdustistan would become one of the most advanced and progressive micronations ever to exist. One field they excelled in the most happened to be that of military engineering. In the 6 years since their nation's construction, countless armored projects have been designed and created by their engineers. Recently, I got in contact with some of Sawdustistan's government officials through their Instagram page to see if I could make a video on the history of their tanks and AFVs. Eventually, they agreed to send me all the information they had about their projects. The first of these were a series of 3 tank designs that would receive the designation Early Concept Design, or ECD, followed by a number, 1 through 3. ECD-1 was a turretless, low-profile design with a heavily angled front plate. The caliber of its gun is unknown, but it was planned to have 45 degrees of elevation and 10 degrees of depression. 2 large cupolas stuck out of the roof for visibility of the surroundings, as well as 2 additional viewports in the front. The rear of the vehicle had 2 large doors for the 2 to 3 crew members. Armor thickness and what was supposed to power the vehicle are both unknown. Just like the rest of the early concept designs, this design would never leave the paper it was drawn on. ECD-2 was a very similar design to Model 1. It was turretless, angled in the front, and had 2 to 3 crew. However, it had several more angles to its armor, and was supposedly longer than the first design, although no specifications were actually given. In addition, the gun mantlet was more conical, and one of the cupolas had been removed. ECD-3 is the third and final of the early designs, and is the most unique of the 3. Unlike 1 and 2, Model 3 has a turret. Other than that, not much is known about it. As previously stated, none of the ECD models were put into production or even prototyped. This was more than likely due to poor planning and loss of the original blueprints of the projects. However, several months later, a prototype vehicle was actually built. The Mark I first production was an open-topped, turretless vehicle designed for close support of the infantry. After a brief testing period, some of the minor bugs were worked out. A roof was added, along with a hull-mounted machine gun for defensive use. A single light was mounted in the top center for night combat. Its armor ranged from 5 to 10 mm and was at around a 45-degree angle in the front to maximize effectiveness. The main armament was a 20 mm 3-round autoloader with an additional 12 rounds carried on board. The defensive machine gun had a 10-round capacity and fired 12.7 mm caseless ammunition, and took around 20 seconds to fully reload. The vehicle and all of its weapon systems were operated by a single person. The interior was quite cramped, and the operator had to sit directly behind the gun breech. The Mark I also had the most unusual mobility out of any of Sawdustistan's domestic tank designs. Similar to that of the Angry Connor from my last Blitz history video, the Mark I drove backwards faster than it did forwards, as a result of its poor traction and overstressing issues. However, much like the Archer, this didn't really impede the tank's ability to fight. Going forward, the Mark I only went around 4 to 5 km per hour, whereas in reverse, it could go over double that. The Mark I would go on to serve in most of the fledgling military's training exercises, and as a training vehicle for the armed forces. The Mark I's production run lasted around a year, with around 27 total units being produced out of the initial 30 ordered. The only recorded variant of the Mark I was the Mark I-2, which had modified running gear to allow for more speed and better mobility. The 20mm autoloader was replaced with a 12.7mm machine gun, and the defensive MG was removed entirely. Only one of these vehicles was produced due to the structural stability issues and difficulty steering. Soon after, a new design was created on the same improved chassis used with the Mark I-2. This was a much more involved project compared to the Mark I, with entirely new design requirements. The Mark II, as it came to be known, was to have a fully traversable turret with 40 degrees of elevation and 10 degrees of depression, and a crew of 2. The Mark II test bed was built to evaluate the mobility of the chassis with the additional weight. It had an average of 5 mm in the front at various angles, and the rear had around 300 mm of spaced armor at varying angles, made up of the same 5mm plates. After multiple tests and minor tweaks were made, the Mark II was finally ready for production. The production version had a turret with the same 20mm gun as the Mark I. The commander pulled double duty as both gunner/loader and the commander. The crew sat single file with one main hatch in the front for both crew members, and a small hatch on the roof of the turret, primarily used by the commander to spot targets, as the turret lacked any periscopes or cupola, and with the only optic available being the gun sight. This wasn't the only issue with the Mark II's turret. If the vehicle went too fast or pitched at an extreme angle, the turret would become disconnected from the hull and occasionally fall off. The Mark II was produced in limited numbers, with only 9 of the 20 ordered being completed. The majority of them sat in reserve for much of their service life, but a few were used for training purposes and propaganda. Around the same time of the Mark II's production run, 2 companies, which would later go on to become the state-run Sawdustistan Foundry and Cobb Industries, competed against each other to create a new tankette for the military. The requirements were for a low-profile, one-man vehicle designed to do well in the snow. The first company came up with the S1A tankette, while the second company constructed the S1B. After initial tests, the S1A would end up as the chosen design due to countless structural errors found in the S1B. The S1A's production was so simple it was decided to manufacture the 3 main parts and then transport them separately to the front line, where they could be assembled by the crews. S1A tankettes were planned to be used in the invasion of Sawdustistan and Rockistan during Operation Sandstone, but due to the heavily unpredictable terrain of the area, the S1s became bogged down and the attack had to continue on foot. But with the cost of production for the S1 being so low, many of the quality issues were made up for with quantity. Around 38 vehicles were built in total, but over half of them were lost during Operation Sandstone and never recovered. Following the partial success of the S1A was the S2A, or just S2. This used the chassis and suspension system of the Mark I, but since there was so little armor, it made the vehicle very light and very fast. In fact, it was the fastest vehicle ever built by the Saudi military. During its testing, the test driver lost control of the vehicle after hitting too high of a speed and flipped the entire vehicle on top of themselves. Needless to say, the project was halted after this incident. Sometime after, the Saudi military did some minor restructuring and organizational changes. Among these were the new classifications for armored vehicles. The new naming system would have the prefix of SDA, standing for Sawdustistan Defense Army, followed by the model number. All designs were given this designation. For example, the Mark I would become the SDA-1, and its variant would become the SDA-2. This was more of a formal naming system, however, as the tank crews and much of the population still referred to it as the Mark I. The first new vehicle to adopt this system was the SDA-8. This was an open-top turretless tankette mounting the same 20mm autoloader as the Mark I and II. Armor thickness in the front varied from 5 to 30mm and a 2mm gun mallet. It also had a new chassis with better handling than the last tankettes, as well as improved suspension. During testing, the SDA-8 performed well, but offered no real advantages over previous designs. After seeing an almost non-existent service life, the few that existed lived their final moments as hard targets on a firing range before eventually being scrapped. A similar follow-up design known as the SDA-9 was created 1 year later. It had around 40mm of spaced armor at varying angles in the front, but was also open-topped and still carried the now outdated 20mm autoloader. Its chassis was the same as that of the SDA-8, but the 9 was significantly wider, allowing for more ammunition storage. At some point, the SDA-9 was planned to be upgunned, with 7 out of the 10 units produced being re-barreled to eventually house a 55mm gun. However, none of these guns were ever produced, and the project was soon cancelled. Only one partial SDA-9 exists today, with the rest of them being scrapped. The SDA-9 series was the most recent of the vehicles to be completed by Sawdustistan. But just like many countries, for every produced tank, there is at least 2 obscure prototypes or blueprint-only designs. In part 2 of this video, I'll cover the more outlandish and in some cases impossible tank designs proposed by the Saudi engineers. Hopefully you've enjoyed this dive into the much lesser known depths of tank history. If you've enjoyed, consider leaving a like or a comment. Until next time, I'm the Tank Nerd. Thanks for watching.